If you're in a fair fight, your tactics suck. And if you're playing fair in a gunfight, you're dead. Many tools have been developed to gain the advantage in a firefight, from shields, cameras, and more powerful weapons. But there's one piece of equipment that's undoubtedly the loudest and most dramatic way to end a fight. And subsequently, this tool has been featured in many different games. Of course, I'm talking about the flashbang. In modern times, flashbangs are usually associated with military and law enforcement. Most of us have seen news footage or media depictions of police raids, where a flashbang precedes officers bursting into a room, taking down the bad guys, and saving the day. But in reality, flashbangs can be used in a variety of different ways, much more than depicted in video games. The history of the flashbang begins in the 1970s. At the time, there were a number of high-profile terrorist attacks that had taken place, and as such, countries were looking to upgrade their arsenals against this new threat. A tactic terrorists employed was to take hostages. Cowardly, but unfortunately effective. It's an incredibly precarious situation for would-be rescuers. One poorly aimed shot from the good guys can lead to the death of an innocent person. A solution was needed. One idea was a device that could subdue a target non-lethally without causing any permanent damage to innocent bystanders. By all accounts, it was the British Special Air Service that first requested a stun grenade for use in hostage situations. British military scientists with the Royal Ordnance Enfield got to work. The end result was the G60 stun grenade. It's important to note that a flashbang is not a grenade. A grenade, by definition, launches some kind of projectile, typically shrapnel. Flashbangs like the G60 do not. The G60 produced a blinding flash and a sound equivalent to about 160 decibels. This does three things to an individual unfortunate enough to be in the vicinity. It blinds them, deafens them, and disrupts their balance. But it does not kill. So with the G60, the first flashbang was born. The SAS used the G60 to great effect. During the Iranian embassy siege, the SAS used the G60 to take down terrorists who were holding hostages. Throwing the flashbang into a room with hostiles provided the SAS enough time to take down the bad guys without harming any bystanders. Since then, many different types of flashbangs have been created. While most are brighter and louder, some of the most important advancements actually involve the safety of these devices. Modern flashbangs are designed to produce very specific levels of light and noise, so as to ensure the target is sufficiently affected without causing permanent damage. There are also modern variants for different types of scenarios, like low-light models and versions that detonate multiple times. When flashbangs were first introduced, their usage was quite simple. Pull the pin and throw towards the enemy. But as the technology of flashbangs advanced, the tactics used to deploy them have evolved as well. It's important to note that the word flashbang is a colloquial term. The proper designation for these tools is distraction device. It's a fitting name. It captures exactly what they're meant for. Flashbangs are incredibly bright, incredibly loud, and create an overpressure wave that can disrupt an individual's balance. All these traits in combination means that for the uninitiated, being flashbanged is terrifying. A hostile who has never felt the effects of a flashbang will be effectively stunned, and the majority will end up surrendering. Even an individual who is hell-bent on causing violence will be quickly dissuaded after riding the bang. Some individuals who've never felt the effects of a flashbang before reported that they thought frag grenades were being used against them. For most suspects, the psychological effect of the flashbang is more than enough to make them surrender. Oftentimes, especially in law enforcement, flashbangs are used on their own to gain control over a hostile. Most of us envision SWAT teams rushing into a room after a flashbang has been thrown. But in reality, law enforcement often deploy flashbangs without entering the room at all. If there's no one else in a room other than a non-compliant suspect, A common tactic used by SWAT teams is to deploy a flashbang in the room without entering, then continue to verbally command for the suspect's compliance. Just like SWAT teams themselves, flashbangs are a life-saving tool, used to demand a surrender before a situation escalates into a deadly one. Flashbangs are a very powerful tool, but they do have limitations. For the inexperienced, flashbangs are devastating, but those who have experienced them more than once become used to the effects. SAS operators, seasoned SWAT team members, and even career criminals who've been raided by police more than once report that the effects of a flashbang become less potent the more they experience it. Much like a disease, people do build an immunity towards flashbangs. Cover can also significantly nullify the effects. Even a couch is enough to mostly protect someone from a flashbang, and the effects of a flashbang don't last very long. Typically only about 1 to 2 seconds. On the other end of the spectrum, flashbangs can be too powerful for their own good. The shockwave from a flashbang has the potential to break fragile objects like glass, which can injure bystanders. There have also been reports of flashbangs causing permanent hearing damage. And additionally, flashbangs are a fire hazard. In fact, during the Iranian embassy siege, the fire that occurred during the raid was accidentally started by a flashbang. Due to these risks, some law enforcement agencies are actually moving away entirely from using flashbangs. The professionals that continue to use them take measures to work around these risks. Almost all SWAT teams will not deploy a flashbang into a room unless they can see into the room, and can positively ID who's in it. For instance, the presence of children would almost certainly mean a flashbang would not be deployed. Failing to do so can result in bystanders being severely injured. SWAT teams also carry fire extinguishers in the event a flashbang does cause a fire. As for the operators themselves, most wear eye and ear protection while deploying flashbangs. The eye protection is self-explanatory, but ear protection does two things. It lessens the loud bang, and it also protects the ears from the shockwave produced, which prevents the operator from having their balance disrupted. As a result, flashbangs are a useful tool among many. In the right circumstances, they are great for providing sufficient distraction to discourage suspects from violence. But like any tool, they must be used properly. Before we continue, I want to give a big thank you to Rob from Daisho Tactical. Rob has served as a law enforcement officer and SWAT officer for more than 20 years. He also runs a YouTube channel where he talks about firearms, equipment, and tactics. Rob was gracious enough to sit down and talk to me about how flashbangs are used in reality, and I can't thank him enough for that. Go to the link below and check him out. You'll definitely learn something. So, that's how flashbangs are used in real life. But what about games? Most games actually exaggerate the blinding effects of a flashbang. While they're certainly bright, most won't cause complete blindness, as seen in many games. Generally, most games depict the deafening part fairly well, but almost no game depicts the loss of balance that a flashbang causes. Another thing most games don't get right is the consistency of a flashbang's effect, or rather, the lack thereof. As noted, individuals who've been flashbanged before are less susceptible to their effects, but in pretty much every game, everybody reacts to flashbangs in the same way, whether they be an innocent bystander or seasoned operator. And finally, most games don't depict the difference in effectiveness of a flashbang in an enclosed area versus in an open area. The shockwave a flashbang produces can reflect off hard surfaces, meaning that flashbangs are much more effective in an enclosed area. In an open space, flashbangs are much less effective. But in games, the environment doesn't usually change the strength of a flashbang. Superficially, most games get flashbangs somewhat right. The flash and the bang are certainly present, but the shockwave, subsequent imbalance, and general psychological effect just aren't there. This could be attributed to a fundamental difference. Flashbangs in real life are a tool used to gain compliance. By design, they need to distract a would-be assailant effectively enough to induce a surrender. In contrast, most games implement flashbangs as a tool for a momentary distraction, used to peek an opponent who's holding down an angle, blinding an opponent to get the drop on them, is primarily how flashbangs are used in games. While this isn't realistic, it makes sense from a game balance perspective. After all, if a flashbang were to make players consistently surrender, no one would use anything else. Whether in video games or in real life, flashbangs are incredibly useful. The differences between the real ones and virtual depictions can be attributed to one simple fact. Flashbangs in games are meant to facilitate the taking of lives, while in reality, flashbangs save lives.